The Great Awakening hits Virginia in the late 1740s in a very orderly way, thanks to a man by the name of Samuel Davies. As a dissenter from the established church, this Presbyterian preacher, willing to abide by the English Act of Toleration that established certain rules for dissenters who wanted to worship in their own way outside the Church of England. Presbyterians tend to like everything done in a neat, orderly fashion. A lot of them come out of Scotland. They come from some other countries as well, but Scotland is the primary one. They generally make a fair amount of money, and they handle it beautifully, and they tend to want everything in order. I don't remember the wording out of their book, but I think it's something about in perfect order. And so when they come along, if the law says, go get a license, Samuel Davies says, I'll go get a license. So he presents himself in Williamsburg, goes and gets a license. He's greeted by the Anglican establishment. Not everybody, including Governor Gooch, is thrilled to see him, and there are some interesting conversations that go on, but he eventually gets his license and is allowed to preach. The powers that be don't balk until he tries to license a 7th and then an 8th Presbyterian meeting house. His ministry extended over 7 counties. Davies preached that salvation was accomplished solely through God's grace and emphasized a dramatic, inward, spiritual transformation. Davies did not preach against slavery, and he may have owned slaves himself, but he ministered to enslaved people in his ministry and purchased hymnals and Bibles for them. He spoke once of being carried away to heaven as he listened to a group of slaves gathered at his house singing hymns. Colonial Williamsburg has recently refurbished a meeting house used by a group of Presbyterians in and around Williamsburg after they petitioned the county court in 1765 for permission to worship. It's down near the Capitol. It's a very spare room where if a licensed Presbyterian minister were nearby, the people in Williamsburg who were of the Presbyterian mind could actually gather in that meeting house and either read the scripture or discuss anything about their faith. They wanted to do this without being threatened. Licensed Presbyterian ministers were often sent from Hanover County, and this provided a safe space. Samuel Davies was on horseback a tremendous amount of time. He was not a very well person. He was haunted with all sorts of physical ailments, and he just kept on going. It's amazing. He was a familiar figure in Williamsburg, having married Jane Holt, a member of a well-known Williamsburg family. He was great friends with his brother-in-law, Anglican John Holt, then training as a printer in Williamsburg, and thereby gained access to the Virginia Gazette newspaper. Davies published a number of religious poems and a long polemic justifying the new side, or evangelical, Presbyterian theology. He had a place called Polgreen, which was a meeting house outside of Richmond in Hanover County, and that was a huge influence on a young Patrick Henry. The Presbyterians really have a big stake in what happened with the Revolution because they've been behind the scenes churning things up. And when Davies is preaching, he gets into the politics. There are a lot of people that think politics has no place from the pulpit. There are other people that think that it's part of the responsibility for politics to be in the pulpit. Whichever side you fall on, Samuel Davies was great at recruiting men to fight in the French and Indian War with sermons that appealed to their loyalty to England in the war with the French and their Indian allies. As a young child, Patrick Henry heard Davies preach because his mother, Mrs. Henry, was brave enough to take him with her to go listen. That speaking style and that inspired way of presenting himself is in Patrick Henry as a young person, and that comes across later. Patrick Henry's uncle, the Reverend Patrick Henry, was the Anglican minister in the local parish, so there was religious disagreement among members of the Henry family. When he's inspiring people to be politically alive, politically active, a lot of that comes from his having learned from Davies' oratorical style in his inspirational sermons. Davies left Virginia in 1759 to accept an invitation to be president of the College of New Jersey, which we call Princeton. He died there in 1761. The Baptist itinerant preachers are here by the 1760s. Most of them spend a fair amount of time in jail because they will not go to Williamsburg for the proper license. There's always a silver lining in situations, no matter what they are. And when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are talking about their lives and talking about their situation, they talk about the fact that Baptist preachers are in jail, and yet the Anglican clergy are entertaining, riding horses, preaching sermons, gathering tax money, doing everything that they think is right. And the poor Baptist guys who believe in the same Lord Jesus Christ and the same Bible are stuck in jail. So things begin to bubble. And when a young James Madison and a young Thomas Jefferson are in Williamsburg, they rub shoulders with a man by the name of George Mason, who is one of Mr. Washington's dear friends and neighbors. His home is Gunston Hall, which is up on the Potomac. And George Mason is an incredible wordsmith. So when he's putting things together, he can take other people's thoughts and put them into language that is just perfect. His words are just golden. Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, Article 16, as Mason wrote it, called for the fullest toleration in matters of differing religious views. As adopted, Article 16 was amended to read, the free exercise of religion, reflecting James Madison's and others' desire to move beyond toleration to freedom of conscience. Dissenters, such as Baptists, let them be Baptists, and Presbyterians. They welcomed this wording, but it was not until Thomas Jefferson introduced his bill for establishing religious freedom in 1779, finally passed in 1786, that the old Anglican state church in Virginia was disestablished once and for all. The playing field was now level for Baptists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and even atheists. And so things begin to change. I see it as waves, gentle waves in the beginning, lapping at the foundation of the Church of England. And then as the waves pick up, it begins to rock the foundation. And by the time you get to 1776, the revolution is exploding all around you. You'd think that the last thing people are worried about at that moment is where people go to church, because they're in a survival mode. Yet from 1776 onward, through the Revolution, the Virginia Convention and the General Assembly under the independent Commonwealth of Virginia continue to take time to change the wording in the Book of Common Prayer, to eliminate prayers for the British royal family, and to grapple with the payment of church taxes. Jefferson's statute of 1779, which we'll talk about some more, it took years to get it passed, not until 1786. But when it does get passed, then Madison can move it into the Constitution, as well as the First Amendment to that document, the First Freedom, as it is sometimes called. And after all these years of conversation, religious freedom, like democracy, is a process. It is also rather like a messy room. It doesn't happen overnight. None of this happens overnight. By the time they've gotten from conversation to writing down an idea, to getting that idea into a form, to go into committee, and then you know how committees can work, then it has to get before a law-making body that's going to make it into a statute, and then everybody has to abide by it. That's a long process. I don't mean to belabor the point, but when you're going to do that, you've got to look at what's already in place. Well, what's in place is the Church of England. So to allow religious freedom to everybody else, Jefferson, Madison, Mason, and all the other leaders, all those men on the Committee of Religion, have to literally unravel their own church to allow freedom to everybody else. And that takes faith, because they have to believe that there's a better way. All that had to change, and it must have been absolutely daunting to them to realize that somehow they had to find a new way to make it work. So, in a simple form, almost everything that we now go to the government for or to the government about, we used to go to the church for. So they had to unravel that whole system and create a civil system of some sort that would satisfy those needs. You can't do any of that overnight. Just the roads part, not to mention the welfare part. Imagine the parishes having to rely on voluntary contributions to pay their ministers, repair churches, and meet other expenses once paid for by the parish levy or tax levied by the parish vestry to pay for those things, as well as support for the poor and disabled. It wasn't until 1780 that the General Assembly established overseers of the poor in each county to take over the public welfare function of the established church in colonial times. And it was after 1800 before the matter of church buildings and lands purchased with public tax money before 1776 was settled. The other colonies had a lot of energy in the Great Awakening too. The Church of England is suffering because we have no bishops here. Not just in Virginia, but not in any of the colonies. So in order for any of the big decisions, you really do need a bishop, specifically for ordination and confirmation. So you can't go ahead unless you have clergy, and you can't have clergy unless you have ordination. You can't have ordination unless you have a bishop. So even back with King James I, people said to him, "We want to get rid of your bishops." He said, "Oh, no bishop, no king," because he was the head of the church. So he wouldn't let that happen, which gave the Puritan party a fit. But people in the other colonies argued about whether or not to have a bishop, just the way the people in Virginia did. And they played it out on the front page of the newspaper. And they played it out in society, and it was a big issue with people as to whether or not we should have a bishop. Well, you can imagine how the English felt when they see all these other denominations cropping up around them, gaining strength, and the English church is losing strength. They must have been absolutely paralyzed with fear. And in Virginia, the statistic was so clear. We had 255 churches. At the end of the Revolution, we had 15 left. Anything which said England was hated. These lovely buildings were turned into taverns or stables or worse. Many of them were torn down. Some were burned. Some of them have different names on them now. They may have been Church of England in the beginning, but they've got a different flavor on them now, or they're gone. So in Virginia, the Church of England suffered tremendously. Now, some gentlemen of faith who were clergy wanted so much to keep an Anglican communion alive. And some of those leaders included Bishop Madison, who before he was Bishop Madison, he was President James Madison at the College of William and Mary. He's a relative of President Madison, of course. We had Dr. Bracken, who was rector of this church. We had Dr. Wilmer. We had a number of other clergy leaders here in Virginia who were determined. I kind of see it as a life raft. They were just going to hang on. And once you get one bishop consecrated, which is Seabury, then you get another bishop consecrated, then you get another bishop consecrated. Well, now you can kind of take a deep breath and say, okay, the church can move forward. We can set up new parishes, we can ordain people, and the church gets on its feet again. So what rises out of the ashes of revolution is the American Episcopal Church. And it has a lot of the traits of the Church of England, but it is an American institution. That Great Awakening, that breath of God, that Ruach spirit, put a spirit in our history which is totally American. The Great Awakening is more egalitarian. That is, everyone is equal in the sight of God. All people, no matter whether rich or poor, white or black, are equally in need of redemption. It's full of enthusiasm. In Virginia, it's fairly well behaved, but when it gets out into the mountains, the Great Awakening just rocks. So then it spreads like more waves lapping on the shore across the country. And when you think of where it started, with George Whitefield preaching, "What think ye of Christ?" That was a very brave thing for him to do, because he's asking the people sitting in the pews to think for themselves and to try to figure out, why do we follow this carpenter? So it has long-term results that go all the way across the country. And when you look at the denominations available in this country now, it is mind-boggling. And we don't use phone books much anymore because of cell phones and computers, and the internet, but phone books would frequently have pages and pages and pages of churches in every town, because we have such a choice on Sunday morning or Friday night or whenever you want to go to worship. So the Great Awakening is long-term, and ever so often I think that we're still in it. The changes in the church now, the Reformation that we're in, has a lot of the same hallmarks. Society and the church are still trying to figure out that there's this very interesting dance they do to try to figure out who's doing what and who's moving how. But the Great Awakening wasn't a static event. It just seems to be available again, and that's the beauty of the Spirit, you know. But these people who lived it, I think the hallmark of it is they had faith that God knew what he was doing with it. And when these men walked the streets of Williamsburg and prayed in this church, they were looking for divine guidance, but they probably felt that only by keeping the church together could they anchor society. And George Mason's Declaration of Right, which is the Virginia Declaration, that becomes a pattern a little bit later, going in with the American Bill of Rights, and it's in the United Nations Charter. The same concepts, which is phenomenal to think of George Mason from Virginia putting down stuff which people in Uganda now hope to live by. Or those countries in the Russian area, you know, the Sino-Soviet area, every so often it's a new country with a new name. If they're part of the United Nations, they're under that umbrella of George Mason's intellect.